I just wanted to do a couple videos on what's in my shop. So I wanted to do some videos on tools specifically, so talking about maybe a particular chop saw or a particular table saw, but I also wanted to do a video on just the basics. I've had a bunch of people reach out to me and kind of say, I'm just getting started in woodworking. What are some of the things I need? So I guess when I talk to them, I say to them, well, what are you interested in building? I know for myself, when I started woodworking, a lot of the things I made were very square. So a lot of square profiles, square shapes. So a regular chop saw and a table saw were perfect. That's all I needed. But as I kind of evolved in woodworking, I started making curves and different shapes and rounded portions on things. So I had to kind of evolve my tool set. So what I want to do is just talk about, what tools do I need to kind of get started, and as I evolve, what tools are going to help me kind of take those next steps. So hopefully in the comments I can get some other viewers to kind of help out, and maybe if there's something I missed, there's something that maybe you see a very essential tool that maybe I didn't talk about, perhaps you can mention it. I'd really appreciate that. But just in this video, I just want to talk about, if you're looking to get started in woodworking, what are some tools I need? What are some basic things that would really help me just get started? And as I evolve, what are some tools that I could add to my arsenal to try to make things maybe a little more complicated or maybe a little more unique? So hope you enjoy. One of the best ways I thought that I could actually go through this video is by showing you an example of what I would do with a piece of wood. So let's just say I went to the store, I bought this piece of wood, it's got some rough edges on it, it's got some rough faces on it, there's bandsaw marks, all that. What I need to do is I need to start by making this piece of wood square so it's usable. The tool to do that is called a jointer and a planer. So usually they're two different tools, but in my case I have a combination tool. So it's a jointer and planer combination. Now what a jointer does is a jointer makes things flat. So it has a wheel, and the wheel has blades on it. So when I pull this piece of wood across this surface is flat, and it adjusts, this drops relative to this side, and what it does is how much you drop it depends on how much is taken off. But essentially these blades will cut the bottom of the wood and make it flat. So you won't always get it the first time, sometimes you have to run it across a few times, but what you're doing is you're pulling the piece of wood across these blades and it makes this surface flat. Now I will also do one of the edges. The edges are generally not flat when you buy a piece of wood at the store, so I'll also make an edge flat. Now the thing to really keep in mind is they are only flat. They're not square and they're not parallel. So if I pull this across a jointer, these two edges are not parallel and they're not square. The faces are also not square to one another. You just have a flat one. So I'll show you what we do after we get a face and an edge flat. This face is now flat. To test that, what I do is I just set it on my worktop and I look to see if there's any gaps, and I also try to tilt it. It's nice and flat. Now I'm going to do an edge. This is my rough edge here. This is my rough edge. Let's take it across the jointer. This edge is now flat. This face is now flat. I've got one flat face and one flat edge. But again, they are not square and they are not parallel to each other. So all I've got is two flat surfaces. Okay, so in your shop, you might have a jointer and a planer that are separate. In my case, I have a jointer and a planer that are one unit. So what I need to do now is I need to convert from the jointer to the planer. So this wood is 1 5/8, so I'm going to adjust my bed to be 1 5/8. When we're in jointer mode, we pulled the piece of wood across the blades. Now, what a planer does is it'll pull the piece of wood over the blades. So you have, just show you really quickly, what you have is a bed that the wood slides on, and then up underneath is the teeth for cutting. Okay, so what it does is it pulls the wood through the machine, keeps that flat face on the flat surface, and cuts off the undulated surface. So when I plane this, I'm going to put my jointed flat face down, and the blades are going to cut the top. So what that just did is it made my jointed face parallel with my planed face. So now I have two flat surfaces that are parallel to each other and flat. Now what I have to do is I have to deal with the edges, because I have one flat unsquare edge, and I have to make this other face parallel to it, but I have to also make them square to these faces. I'll show you how to do that. Okay, there's one other thing I wanted to mention really quickly. Jointers normally have fences, so I didn't have my fence on my jointer when I originally jointed these edges on this board, so I just thought I'd quickly show you. In my shop, it's a little bit cumbersome because I have to flip this up, and then the fence hits the dust collector, and it's just kind of in the way. So what I do is I'll joint an edge and then take it to my table saw and cut it. But in cases, I will actually take and use my fence. So if I joint this edge using my fence, then this board will come out with a square edge relative to whatever face I've jointed. So what I would do in this situation is I would joint the face. So now I have a flat face. Then I put that jointed face against the fence, and I take it across the jointer. Then that jointed face and this new jointed face are now square. Now again, I don't have it on because I'm restricted with space a little bit, and also sometimes I actually do find it easier to get a really square edge with the table saw rather than jointer, because this has to actually be squared up to the base, so you have to manually do that, make this square to this. Table saw, same thing, you have to make your blade square to your top. I simply find it a little bit easier to do it on table saw, but this is a very good method for doing it. It's just you have to set it up, and again, I'm just a little bit tight for space, so that is one option. All right, before I make these edges square and parallel to one another, what I'll do sometimes is I'll go over and I'll cut a rough length of what I want. Okay, so what I will do is I will use my chop saw for that. Now, chop saws to me are a very important tool. They are able to cut something down. In this case, I have a 12-inch blade, so I'm able to make very deep cuts, and also it's a sliding miter saw, so you can slide this way out and make long cuts, and you can chop through very thick things. The issue with the chop saw is it doesn't tend to be square, because what happens is you have this bed that moves, so you can cut different angles. So if I wanted to move this bed, I could cut an angle like that, or I could also tilt the saw itself and make an angled cut down. So there's a lot of adjustability in these, which unfortunately causes things to not always be square. So when I cut this end, if I cut this piece off that I don't really want, right, so I take my 14 inches that I'm interested in, cut this off, it's not necessarily going to be square in this direction and this direction. So it's kind of a rough cut. Now, I've adjusted mine so it's very, very close, but still, it's better to make your final length cuts on a table saw. So this guy, I'm just going to use my chop saw to basically get myself really close to the length that I want. Okay, so I want 14 inches. I've got some checking on each end, so what I'm going to do first is I'm actually just going to trim off this one end. I have quite a bit of room to work with, so I'm going to cut this end off. And that just gets rid of a little bit of garbage that was on the end, okay? And I look at it and I see, okay, there's no big checks, there's no big cracks or anything, so I feel comfortable with this end. The other end has lots of cracking and checking, so I want to take the majority of the length off of this end. So I'll put it here. I'm going to mark off I need 14 inches, but I'm going to leave it a little bit longer because the final length cut I'm going to actually do on my table saw. So I'm making a cut that's close to what I need, but getting rid of all the garbage on the end. So there, I got rid of my checking, all these cracks. I look at this side, no more cracks, no more cracks, so that's good. So I know I've got a pretty competent piece of wood here to work with. Okay, so what I use the chop saw generally for is making some of these larger cuts. If I go to the store, buy a really big piece of wood, say maybe it's 10 feet by 8 inches, 2 inches thick, I bring it over to here, I do some of my rough cutting, and I'll take my smaller pieces of wood and work with those. Okay, so far we've taken our piece of wood, we jointed one face, and we jointed one edge. What I did is I actually put a little J on there just for myself, so I know I jointed this side, this face, and I know I jointed this edge. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to put the side that I jointed against the fence. Now again, it is not square. Okay, it's not square because we just put across a jointer just to make it flat. So what I want to do is I want to use that flat edge against the fence. Again, it's not square, just flat, but it allows me to put the piece of wood across the table saw in a straight line. Okay, so what we'll do is we're gonna adjust the fence, and I'm just gonna make kind of a rough cut. All I want to do is skim this one edge, so I line up my blade so it's just going to hit. Okay, so it's just going to touch that edge. All right, so I have my jointed face down and my jointed face against the fence. Now I'm going to make this edge flat and square at the same time. Of course, before I did anything, I made sure my blade was square. Okay, so the blade is nice and square to the tabletop. So I have a flat face, a flat edge, and now I'm going to make a flat square edge where it was completely undulated and rough cut. What I just created was a flat surface that is 90 degrees square to this flat face. So now I have a flat face and a flat and square edge. And I always after that cut, I always make sure I'm nice and square. Okay, beautiful. So now what I want to do is I want to take this flat, not square edge, flip the board around, and now I'm going to make the cut that will square this edge, but also I feel like I'm ready to make the right width. So the width I was looking for was 3 5/8. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my blade to 3 5/8. So what I'm going to do is in one cut, I'm going to make this edge square to this face, and I'm also going to cut the width I want. Okay, so now I have a piece of wood. It's close to the length I want. I've got two flat faces that are parallel to each other, and I also have two edges that are parallel to each other, and they're 90 degrees to each face. This is called an S4S board. So this is where I will start doing most of my work, because now I've got a square piece to use, okay? So the next thing I really want to do is I want to cut these ends to be exactly the length I want. And I'll show you how to do that with a table saw and a sled. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to use my table saw to cut the exact lengths that I want this board to be. How I'm going to do that is with a sled. If you look at your table saw, you have two large notches. These are so you can slide different tools through. So this is a miter gauge that you can put in there. You can angle it so you can make cuts. So essentially, if I wanted to cut this board, I could just put this across, pulls it across the blade, and I can make an exact square cut, okay? That's one way I can cut my length. The other way is I can use a sled. So a sled uses these two slots as well. This is a homemade sled. It's got a 1/4 inch birch ply bottom and 2 strips of maple that are lined up to go right into these slots, and they can slide across. Now this, it looks a little funny. Usually there's not all this extra material on here, but I use this for doing a lot of joinery. So what I can do with this is I can actually just use this portion of the sled and pull it across the blade to make a cut. Now because this blade is straight and I have made this sled to be exactly 90 degrees to the blade, when I pull this piece of wood across to make the cut, it is perfectly square. It'll be square in this cut and also like this. So you're square and square. I'll show you an example of how I would use this. So my first cut is just to get this end squared. It's not to get my length. So now this end is square this way and square this way. I'm going to make the next cut using the miter gauge. So this face is 90 degrees to this. So what I can do is I will mark the length I require. So here it was 14 inches. I will line my mark up with the blade. Now just a little note, in doing this cross cut, I'm not using the fence because I don't want the wood to bind between the blade and the fence. That's a rip cut, and this is a cross cut. When I'm doing a cross cut, because the length of the board is wider than the width, it becomes unstable when it's between a fence and a blade. So what I want to do is I want the piece of wood to be completely independent of the fence, and I just want to use the miter gauge. Okay, so I'm going to line up the blade with my mark. That looks good. Okay. Okay, now I have a board that is S4S, square on each end, and the proper length that I want. So just a couple of the things I thought I'd mention about a table saw right now. This miter gauge, you can change the angle on it and change this face. So what you could do is change the angle, so basically you can pull this board across at an angle. It'll make a nice angled cut. Also, this blade can articulate side to side, so you can, you can take your fence, pull a board across, and make an angle. I think mine cuts up to 45 degrees, so I can make a 45-degree cut on this and give this piece of wood a nice angle. One other thing that I use a lot is this guide as well. So if I want to make a long cut on a board that is angled, what I do is I make a jig. This jig sits, one side sits flat against the fence, and then what I would do is I would clamp this board to this device, jig, And what I would do is just pull the whole thing across the blade, and it'll cut a nice angle. You can use it like that, or use it like this, and cut a nice angle across this board. So you can, there are a variety of different jigs you can actually buy that do this same thing, but I just made this one. It's a 6-degree jig for making cuts on a rocking chair. So that allows you to make different angled cuts, or you can tilt the blade to make different cuts. So another type of blade that you can use on a table saw, which is really interesting, is called a dado blade. So that is a stack of blades that all mount up on the spindle. So what that does is it'll cut a notch in something. So it's not really made to cut the length of a piece of wood, it cuts out a notch. I'll show you an example of how that works. So I set my blade height, I'll set my fence. Just as an example, I'll just show you how it works. You're going to put the wood across the blade, nice and slowly and carefully. So the dado blade makes a nice notch in the wood. Now, one of the things I use it mostly for is joinery. So if I have two pieces of wood that I want to join together using a notch like this, what I can do is make this dado cut to be the same width as this. So this is 11/16. I just set my blade in my fence to make a slightly wider cut. So now I have one edge. Now I'm just going to widen this cut a little bit. Okay, so now I've made a dado cut in the wood that matches the width of this. Okay, so there you can make a nice little joint. So that's one of the things I use a dado blade for, but I also do it for a lot of joinery, and you can also do it to make certain notches in wood, but this is one of the things I use it mostly for, is stuff like this. Okay, so up until this point we've talked about the joiner and planer that gets your wood flat. Then we talked about the chop saw that gets kind of your lengths worked out for you a little bit. And then we also talked about the table saw that can make things square, and it can also make your lengths. And it can also do like dado cuts for different types of joinery. It can make angled cuts, it can make mitered cuts, it can do all sorts of things. You make yourself a sled, or use your different types of homemade guides, and you can do a lot of things with the table saw. Now, that allows you to do some pretty basic stuff with square wood. The next tool that I really like is a router. So routers come in a lot of different ways. I have everything from a cordless small router that holds 1/4-inch bits, all the way up to quite a large Festool router that holds 1/2-inch and 1/4-inch bits. It's a plunging router, so you can actually adjust. You can adjust the depth so that guy moves up and down. And you can use a variety of bits and templates, and you can use brass guides to do all sorts of things. So you have a lot of versatility. This one's a little more simple. This one's just for doing kind of like little rounded edges and stuff, but I actually do a lot of joinery with a router. And also you can move all the way up into this, which is a table saw router insert. So what you have here is a router mounted underneath, and the bit comes up onto the table. So what that allows you to do is have a nice flat working surface. So you're able to pull a large piece across the bit. In other situations with a hand router, you'd have to pull the router across, which can be a little bit more difficult. But if you're working with just something small, like let's say you just took your wood and you made a cutting board, and you want to put a nice little round on, turn it on. So that was pretty simple and easy. I just made a nice little soft round on this with just a little handheld router. So it can give a nice profile to something, or I actually use it for joinery as well, but this just gives something kind of a nice shape. Now this guy obviously holds slightly larger bits. It can hold small bits, but what's different about it is the fact that instead of holding the tool, I'm holding the workpiece and taking it across the actual tool. So I'll give you a quick demonstration on how that works. Okay, so that bit was a little more aggressive. It took off a lot more material, and for that reason it's nice to have the router solid and me working with the workpiece, because I'm gonna have two hands on it and it's really effective. So I find that to be really quite nice. But the point of this is that it's really nice to have a router of some kind. So you can do little edge detailing. You can get bits to make this flat, to make it angled, to put a notch, make it rounded. You can do almost anything you can imagine. I don't know if there's any other tool that has as many functions as like a router. It has so many different bits that you can put in there and do all sorts of things. You could have also made this notch with a router. You could have taken just a straight bit and cut that out. But I did it with the table saw. But this just allows you to make some really nice shapes and just kind of give a nice effect to something. Okay, so when I start getting into the actual design of a piece, this is kind of how you can finish it off to just give it something like a really nice look. So the other thing I kind of want to mention just quickly is a lot of these tools have hookups for dust collection. So this is a hose at the back that connects to the table saw. My chop saw, I made kind of a system that hooks up a hose and catches a lot of the dust. Now the joiner as well has a connection for dust collection. So do bandsaws. And so what I have, sorry I'm really running around here, what I have is just a nice little dust collector. This guy I think cost me about 300 bucks. It's a 1.5 horsepower and I absolutely love it. It's so powerful. It cleans up all the dust from things. It does a really great job. I really like it. They're pretty common. There are a lot of different brands that make one just like this, but with all the tools I've shown you so far today, definitely need a dust collector. And this one I really love. I think it's awesome. Great tool. Alright, so up until this point we've basically used tools that help us to get things pretty square. So if I wanted now, I could go and join these two pieces. I could use my dado joint that we made to do some different kind of connections and stuff. You could, you know, just do different things. But really, what you're looking at right now are tools and devices to keep everything pretty square. So you can do a lot of different things. You can make rounds and stuff like that, but most of your joinery and the appearance of what you're building is going to be pretty square. Generally speaking, I mean, there are people who do incredible things with table saws to get curves and to do all sorts of really interesting things, but generally speaking, these tools that I've shown you so far keep things pretty square. The next tool that I really love in my shop that is a great addition, I think, is a bandsaw. So let's just say I'm working along here, I have a square leg, but I want to just give it a little bit of character. So what I'm going to do is I actually just want to make this leg so it has a nice curve on it. Okay, so instead of it just being a square piece like that, let's put a curve on it to just make it look a little fancier. Okay, so what I'm going to do is normally I would take a template of something I made or a curve that I like and I would draw it on. Okay, so I've just drew a rough curve on for now. Now I have a curve. So what I just did with the bandsaw is I made this straight edge now have a nice kind of profile to it. So if this is my leg standing up on something like a table, well, now I've got one straight edge and I've got one nicely curved edge. Okay, so that's what the bandsaw allows me to do. The bandsaw I have here, I have quite a large one, but I have this little bandsaw. It's a 14-inch. It has a granite top. This table tilts side to side, so it articulates, so you can do some different angled cuts, but it's a very basic tool. I think I paid about $900 for it. It holds a variety of blade widths. This one I have a 1/4 inch blade in right now. Super easy to use. It takes up a bit of space because it is quite a tall tool, but overall the things you can do with a bandsaw are just incredible. You can cut circles, you can cut shapes, you can cut angled profiles, you can do almost anything. If there was anything beyond your basic tools that I would add to my shop, it would definitely be a bandsaw. Now again, it depends on what you like building. If you like building square things, maybe it's not the best tool for you, but if you want to add a little bit of flair to your pieces, make some curves, make some neat shapes, bandsaw, that's the tool. Love it. Okay, so one other tool that I have that I really like, you might actually, again, depending on what you like to build, you might want to get this before a bandsaw, because it is really functional. So what this is a spindle sander. So basically your spindle sits on top of the machine and it has this piece of sandpaper that is a tube that just basically, the cylinder just basically oscillates up and down and allows you to sand things. Now it also comes with an edge sander piece, so this can be replaced with a spindle and it sits on there, and then it has basically a band of sandpaper that goes around it, so you can do flat sanding. So what you can do is take a piece of wood, put it up along the edge and flatten an edge. So this is parallel to this, so it keeps things square. Now just to keep in the theme of what I was kind of showing you with the bandsaw, I have this set up for a spindle sander right now, and what it allows me to do is sand along a curve. You can also use a hand sander, but it can be a little bit difficult. If you have a 6-inch sander, it doesn't really fit between here very well. So this, just the spindle, allows me to get in here and sand this curve to kind of keep true to the shape, but also get rid of all the bandsaw marks, okay? So I'll show you really quickly how I do that. So what I just did is I used this spindle sander to take the bandsaw marks out of this curve. If I wanted to have this nice and flat and router this edge, I can't have undulations all over the face of this, because the router wheel runs along this and makes a cut. So really this has to be nice and flat. And if it's a leg on a piece, you have to have a nice flat surface without any cut marks on it. So this tool helps me take the sand marks, or sorry, the bandsaw marks out of a cut. Okay, so I have my curved piece clamped to my worktop. I've got my router with a 1/4 inch bit in it, and I'm going to make a cut. So now what we've done is we have taken what would have just been a normal square leg, we put a nice little curve on it, and then gave it some rounds to give it just a nice soft profile. So let's take a closer look here. So what you're doing is you're just kind of pushing the envelope of design. So instead of just kind of square profiles, we made something nice and round. Okay, so we're able to add that little flair with a bandsaw and a nice little spindle sander.